my price is so much more great.
The 1950s were supposed to be Hollywood's golden era of glitz, glamour, and box office triumphs, but not every star-studded spectacle hit the mark. Amid the Technicolor dreams and towering sets lurked a slew of cinematic misfires that audiences quickly forgot. From ambitious epics that drained studio coffers to musicals that missed the beat, these films promised big but delivered flop after flop. So, join us today as we explore 25 forgotten movies from the 1950s that failed miserably. Some cinematic disasters are infamous not just for their content, but for their consequences. The Conqueror, produced by Howard Hughes and starring John Wayne as Genghis Khan.
For while I have fingers to grasp a sword, your treacherous head is not safe on your shoulders.
Is one of Hollywood's most baffling casting decisions. Shot in Utah near a nuclear testing site, the film's production later became linked to cancer diagnoses among cast and crew, Wayne included. Critics ridiculed Wayne's stiff performance and the film's wooden dialogue, while audiences were confused by its historical liberties and awkward tone. Despite its lavish budget and Technicolor visuals, it bombed at the box office and was later pulled from circulation by Hughes himself. Today, The Conqueror is remembered less as a historical epic and more as a tragic emblem of Hollywood hubris.
He says, now let's hear the line. Now he's already established a feeling for this scene.
If a historical epic could flop so disastrously, could sci-fi ambition fare any better in the hands of Ed Wood? If there's a Mount Rushmore of cinematic failure, Plan 9 from Outer Space is carved into it. Directed by Ed Wood and released in 1959,
are they all this powerful on planet Earth?
This one is an exception, Excellency.
This sci-fi horror hybrid featured flying saucers, reanimated corpses, and stock footage of Bela Lugosi, who died before filming began. The plot, involving aliens resurrecting the dead to stop humanity's self-destruction, was incoherent even by B-movie standards. Sets wobbled, dialogue was laughable, and continuity errors abounded. Critics dismissed it as amateurish, and audiences ignored it.
I will get one of the flashlight from the patrol car.
Be careful, please.
I'm a big boy now, Johnny.
Yet its sheer ineptitude earned it cult status decades later, with some calling it so bad it's good. In its time, however, Plan 9 was a commercial and artistic failure, an unintentional comedy that defined Ed Wood's tragic ambition. Before Plan 9, Ed Wood unleashed Bride of the Monster, a 1955 horror film that combined atomic paranoia with gothic absurdity.
Because of the storm, I was afraid you're not going to have guessed.
Starring Bela Lugosi as the Mad Dr. Vornoff and Tor Johnson as his mute henchman, the film centers on a plot to create a race of atomic supermen. Shot on a shoestring budget, it featured rubber octopus props, recycled sets, and dialogue that veered between melodrama and nonsense. Lugosi's performance, though committed, couldn't salvage the film's incoherence. Critics panned it, and box office returns were minimal. Wood's passion was evident, but his technical limitations were glaring. Bride of the Monster failed to impress in its day and remains a cautionary tale of ambition outpacing execution. From the mind of Dr. Seuss came one of the strangest cinematic experiments of the 1950s, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. Directed by Roy Rowland, this surreal musical follows a boy trapped in a dream world ruled by a tyrannical piano teacher. With bizarre sets, rhyming dialogue, and nightmarish choreography, it was unlike anything audiences had seen. Unfortunately, that uniqueness worked against it. Viewers walked out in droves, and critics were baffled by its tone. Columbia Pictures lost money, and the film was quickly buried. Though it later gained cult status for its visual inventiveness, in 1953, it was a commercial disaster. Even Dr. Seuss distanced himself from the project, calling it a depressing failure, despite its creative ambition. Not every masterpiece finds its audience right away. 12 Angry Men, directed by Sidney Lumet and starring Henry Fonda, is now hailed as one of the greatest courtroom dramas ever made. But its initial release told a different story.
You can't talk like that to me.
I feel sorry for you. What it must feel like to want to pull the switch.
Produced on a modest budget and shot almost entirely in one room, the film's intense focus on jury deliberation was praised by critics but failed to attract moviegoers. It earned just $1 million in domestic rentals, barely covering costs. MGM gave it a limited release, and its lack of action or star-studded spectacle made it a tough sell.
Was voting not guilty? 1.
Only decades later did it gain recognition through television broadcasts and academic study. In 1957, however, 12 Angry Men was a box office disappointment. When a tense drama failed to excite ticket buyers, could a youthful MGM musical fare any better? Youthful charm and musical numbers weren't enough to save the affairs of Dobie Gillis from financial failure. Directed by Don Weiss and based on Max Schulman's stories, the film starred Bobby Van, Debbie Reynolds, and Bob Fosse in a lighthearted college romance. MGM hoped to tap into the teen market.
Now there's another example of the way you endear yourself to people. Save your manager.
But the film's modest plot and forgettable songs failed to make an impact. Despite energetic performances and early appearances by future stars, it lost $131,000. A notable figure for a studio already struggling with changing audience tastes. Critics found it pleasant but unremarkable, and it quickly faded from memory. While the Dobie Gillis character would later thrive on television, his cinematic debut was a misfire that never found its footing. Disney's animated Alice in Wonderland may be beloved today, but its 1951 release was anything but triumphant. Walt Disney envisioned a whimsical adaptation of Lewis Carroll's classic, blending surreal imagery with musical interludes.
Well, the fact is, miss, we planted the white roses by mistake.
However, critics accused the studio of Americanizing the source material, stripping it of its British wit and literary nuance. Audiences were similarly unimpressed, and the film failed to recoup its production costs. It was pulled from theatrical rotation and relegated to television broadcasts, where it slowly gained popularity. Disney himself considered it a disappointment.
Marianne!
Don't just do something, stand there! No, go get my gloves, I'm late!
Only in later decades did it achieve cult status, especially among psychedelic-era viewers. In its own time, Alice in Wonderland was a commercial flop, too strange for children, too sanitized for Carol purists. Epic ambition doesn't always translate to cinematic success. The Egyptian, Fox's lavish adaptation of Mika Waltari's best-selling novel, was intended to rival The Ten Commandments and Quo Vadis. With elaborate sets, exotic costumes, and a philosophical storyline about a conflicted physician in ancient Egypt, the film starred Edmund Purdom, Gene Simmons, and Victor Mature. Despite its visual grandeur and Alfred Newman's score, critics found the performances wooden and the pacing sluggish. The film's $3.5 million budget wasn't recouped, and audiences failed to connect with its somber tone.
No god would dare show his face here after dark.
You're a grave robber.
Released during a flood of biblical and historical epics, The Egyptian lacked the emotional resonance of its peers. Today, it's a forgotten relic, technically impressive, but dramatically inert and financially disappointing. Paul Newman's film debut was so embarrassing, he once took out a newspaper ad apologizing for it. The Silver Chalice, directed by Victor Saville, was a biblical epic about a Greek artisan commissioned to design a chalice for the Holy Grail. Despite its spiritual premise and technicolor spectacle, the film was marred by stiff dialogue, awkward performances, and surreal set design that clashed with its solemn tone.
That cup, it excited your adoration.
Newman's portrayal of Basil was criticized as wooden, though he later proved his talent in better roles. The film earned modest returns but failed to justify its budget or expectations. Critics dismissed it as ponderous and pretentious. Though it occasionally resurfaces for its kitsch value, The Silver Chalice remains a debut Newman wished forgotten. Could even a star-studded ensemble salvage audiences' interest after Newman's misfire? What happens when you cram every major historical figure into one film? Chaos. The Story of Mankind, directed by Irwin Allen, attempted to dramatize world history through a celestial courtroom trial judging humanity's fate. Ronald Colman, Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, and the Marx Brothers played historical icons from Socrates to Napoleon.
And suppose these are the Indies. And suppose instead of traveling east, the ship travels west around the Earth.
In a series of disjointed vignettes. Despite its all-star cast, the film lacked cohesion, depth, and narrative flow. Critics called it a parade of caricatures, and audiences were equally unimpressed. Its educational ambitions were undermined by campy execution and tonal inconsistency. Financially, it flopped, and its legacy is one of squandered talent and misguided ambition. The Story of Mankind is now a trivia footnote, Hollywood excess masquerading as historical enlightenment. Few films suffered more from delayed release than Jet Pilot. Produced by Howard Hughes and directed by Joseph von Sternberg, the film starred John Wayne as a U.S. Air Force colonel who falls for a Soviet defector played by Janet Leigh. Filmed in 1950 but shelved for 7 years due to Hughes's obsessive tinkering, it finally premiered in 1957, by which time its Cold War themes and aerial footage felt outdated.
Hey, you! Hey, Molotov!
The once cutting-edge jet sequences had been surpassed by newer technology, and the romance plot was criticized as implausible and dull. Critics panned its pacing and lack of urgency, and audiences stayed away. Despite Hughes's investment and Wayne's star power, Jet Pilot was a commercial dud, an airborne relic grounded by indecision. Adventure, romance, and colonial ambition collided in Untamed, a 1955 Technicolor epic starring Tyrone Power and Susan Hayward. Set against the backdrop of South Africa's Boer frontier, the film followed an Irish woman's journey through war, wilderness, and personal upheaval. Despite its sweeping landscapes and MGM's promotional push, the film failed to ignite interest.
Signal. Let's go!
Critics found the plot meandering and the chemistry between leads underwhelming. The studio hoped to replicate the success of King Solomon's Mines, but Untamed lacked narrative urgency and emotional depth. Its $3 million budget was never recovered, and it quietly disappeared from theaters. Today, it's remembered, if at all,
Ready? Close in!
as a glossy misfire, emblematic of Hollywood's struggle to balance exotic spectacle with compelling storytelling. If exotic romance flopped, could a circus spectacle entice bigger crowds? In the waning days of the decade, Allied artists tried to recapture the magic of the greatest show on earth with the big circus, but the tent collapsed. Starring Victor Mature, Red Buttons, and Vincent Price, the film offered behind-the-scenes drama at a traveling circus, complete with sabotage, romance, and high-wire stunts. Despite its colorful visuals and ensemble cast, it failed to generate excitement. Audiences had grown weary of formulaic spectacle, and critics dismissed it as derivative.
Tú lo has dicho. Tienes razón.
The film's modest box office returns couldn't justify its production costs, and it quickly faded from view. Unlike its Oscar-winning predecessor, The Big Circus lacked emotional resonance and narrative innovation, making it one of the decade's more forgettable attempts at big-top grandeur. Scandal and tragedy fueled the real-life story behind The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, but its cinematic retelling failed to captivate. Directed by Richard Fleischer and starring Joan Collins as Evelyn Nesbit.
So Mr. Stanford White is still my rival. Oh, Evie, grow up.
The film dramatized the infamous 1906 killing of architect Stanford White by millionaire Harry Thaw. Despite its sensational subject and lush period detail, the film struggled with tone, caught between courtroom drama, romantic melodrama, and historical recreation. Critics found Collins miscast, and the screenplay too sanitized to convey the era's moral complexity. Fox hoped for prestige, but the film underperformed and was quickly overshadowed by more daring fare. Though the story remains compelling, The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing couldn't translate its tabloid origins into lasting cinematic impact. Biblical epics were all the rage in the 1950s, but The Prodigal proved that lavish sets and flowing robes couldn't guarantee success. MGM poured money into this retelling of the parable of the prodigal son, starring Edmund Purdom and Lana Turner. The film boasted ornate costumes, elaborate temple scenes, and Technicolor splendor. Yet critics found it hollow and overwrought. Turner's casting as a pagan temptress raised eyebrows, and Purdom's performance lacked gravitas. Despite the studio's hopes to rival Samson and Delilah, the film failed to recoup its $3 million budget. Audiences were unimpressed by its slow pacing and melodramatic tone. The Prodigal quickly faded from view, remembered only as a cautionary tale of style over substance in biblical storytelling. Sometimes prestige projects collapse under their own weight. Raintree County, MGM's answer to Gone with the Wind, starred Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift in a sprawling Civil War romance. Shot in widescreen and Technicolor, it featured elaborate sets and a sweeping score. But production was plagued by Clift's near-fatal car accident, which affected his performance and delayed filming. The final cut ran nearly 3 hours, and critics found it bloated and emotionally flat. Despite Oscar nominations and Taylor's star power, the film failed to recoup its massive budget.
Forever guarding her beloved children.
Audiences were underwhelmed, and MGM took a financial hit. Today, Raintree County is remembered more for its troubled production than its narrative, a grandiose misfire that couldn't live up to its ambitions. Swashbuckling adventure was a staple of 1950s cinema, but The Black Shield of Falworth failed to leave a mark. Universal's medieval tale starred Tony Curtis as a peasant who rises to knighthood, complete with sword fights, castle intrigue, and royal conspiracies. Despite its colorful sets and action sequences, the film was criticized for its simplistic plot and Curtis's Bronx accent, which clashed with the period setting. Audiences found it formulaic, and critics dismissed it as juvenile. It earned modest returns but failed to elevate Curtis's career or the studio's reputation for historical drama. Unlike Ivanhoe or The Adventures of Robin Hood, Falworth lacked charisma and depth.
A certain sense of truth as opposed to making it up or fantasizing, that's what I mean.
Today, it's a forgotten relic. More costume than character, more pageantry than power. Catwomen of the Moon is one of those B-movies that perfectly represents the cheap sci-fi craze of the early 1950s.
Testers made one fatal error, Helen. When they discovered that the atmosphere around us was beginning to disappear.
And why so many of them failed miserably. Shot in hastily assembled sets with bargain costumes and laughable effects, the film follows a group of astronauts who discover a hidden society of telepathic women living on the moon. The premise might sound intriguing, but what unfolds is a dull mess where the Catwomen plan to seduce and manipulate the male crew to steal their spaceship. Critics derided the stiff performances, wooden dialogue, and painfully slow pacing.
The best of the Earth mongrels will be none too.
Audiences were equally unimpressed, and despite being one of the earliest space films in 3D, it fizzled quickly at the box office. Today, it survives only as a camp relic, remembered for how badly it misjudged both science fiction and storytelling. Cultural diplomacy and cowboy swagger made for an uneasy mix in The Barbarian and The Geisha. Directed by John Huston and starring John Wayne as Townsend Harris, the first U.S. consul to Japan, the film attempted to dramatize East-West relations in the 1850s.
So, it's until Albert jumps up.
Unfortunately, Wayne's rugged persona clashed with the film's delicate tone, and critics found his performance stiff and culturally tone-deaf. Huston's vision was compromised by studio interference, and the final cut lacked cohesion. Japanese audiences were unimpressed, and American viewers found it slow and confusing.
That was the giant gong of Kyoto that you just heard, out of the mystic lore of the Orient.
Despite lush cinematography and historical ambition, The film flopped commercially. Today, it's remembered as a miscast misfire, an earnest attempt at cross-cultural storytelling that stumbled under Hollywood's outdated sensibilities. Few adaptations have suffered more studio interference than The Red Badge of Courage. Directed by John Huston and based on Stephen Crane's classic Civil War novel, the film was intended as a psychological exploration of fear and courage. Starring Audie Murphy, a real-life war hero, it promised authenticity and introspection. However, MGM panicked after poor test screenings and slashed the film from 80 minutes to just over an hour. Huston's voiceover narration was added to patch narrative gaps, and the result felt fragmented and rushed. Critics praised its ambition but lamented its mutilation.
Oh boy, listen, it's my first and last battle. Something tells me it's my first and last battle.
It bombed at the box office, and Huston disowned the final product. Though later reevaluated by scholars, Red Badge remains a tragic example of studio sabotage. CinemaScope was still a novelty in 1953, and Beneath the 12-Mile Reef was one of its earliest showcases. But the technology couldn't save the story.
Anytime you pick the glades, you get the same thing.
Directed by Robert D. Webb, the film followed Greek sponge divers in Florida battling rival fishermen. While the underwater photography was groundbreaking, the plot was thin, and the performances, led by Robert Wagner and Terry Moore, were criticized as wooden. Audiences admired the visuals but found little emotional depth. Fox had hoped to replicate the success of The Robe, but 12 Mile Reef failed to make waves at the box office.
And you got him! He's right here on board!
Where?
Its cultural themes were underdeveloped, and its pacing was sluggish. Today, it's remembered more for its technical novelty than its narrative, a watery spectacle that quickly sank from view. When Charlton Heston battles an army of ants, the result is not always high drama. The Naked Jungle, directed by Byron Haskin, cast Heston as a plantation owner in the Amazon facing a swarm of marabunta, flesh-eating ants.
Perhaps. As Fontaine says somewhere in there, each man is 3 men.
Eleanor Parker co-starred as his mail-order bride, adding romantic tension to the survival plot. Though the film was marketed as a thrilling adventure, critics found its melodrama unintentionally hilarious and its special effects underwhelming. The ants, portrayed through stock footage and trick photography, lacked menace.
We've had some strange reports recently. Nothing definite.
Despite Heston's intensity, the film failed to resonate with audiences and earned modest returns. Over time, The Naked Jungle became a camp curiosity, more memorable for its premise than its execution, and largely forgotten in serious cinematic circles. If giant insects couldn't draw audiences into theaters, could a swashbuckling adventure do the trick? Tony Curtis's breakout role in The Prince Who Was a Thief might have launched his career, but the film itself failed to leave a lasting impression. Directed by Rudolph Mattei, this Technicolor swashbuckler set in medieval Arabia featured Curtis as a street thief with royal lineage. The film leaned heavily on action, romance, and exotic spectacle, but critics found the dialogue stilted and the plot formulaic. Curtis's Brooklyn accent clashed with the setting, and his performance was more charisma than craft.
What are you talking about? You can't marry Osgood.
Universal hoped to replicate the success of The Adventures of Robin Hood, but the film earned lukewarm box office and faded quickly. Though Curtis went on to stardom, The Prince Who Was a Thief remains a footnote, colorful but forgettable. By the time The Kettles in the Ozarks hit theaters, the Ma and Pa Kettle franchise had run out of steam.
Miss Grimby, this is Paul, my husband. How do you do?
Likewise, I'm sure.
This 9th installment in Universal's rural comedy series saw Ma Kettle, Marjorie Main, visiting relatives in the Ozarks, while Pa was conspicuously absent. Percy Kilbride had retired from the role. The film recycled familiar gags, relied on slapstick, and offered little narrative innovation. Critics noted the tired formula and lack of chemistry without Pa. Audiences, too, had grown weary of the series' hillbilly humor, and box office returns reflected that fatigue. Though the Kettle films were once reliable crowd pleasers, this entry marked the beginning of their decline. The Kettles in the Ozarks was a quiet flop, closing the curtain on a fading franchise. The Cyclops is one of those low-budget monster flicks that aimed for thrills, but delivered little more than unintentional comedy.
Try to understand. Please.
Directed by Burt I. Gordon, the king of cheap giant creature movies, it follows a search party venturing into a remote Mexican valley looking for a missing pilot. Instead, they stumble upon oversized wildlife, radioactive wastelands, and a 25-foot-tall mutant Cyclops, who just happens to be the lost pilot, horribly deformed by radiation. The film drags endlessly before the monster even appears, and when it does, audiences are treated to laughably poor effects. A badly composited giant with a lumpy mask and one bulging eye. Critics dismissed it as another schlocky B-picture, and even monster fans found it weak compared to Gordon's later work. At the box office, it flopped and quickly vanished, remembered now only as a clumsy radiation paranoia relic of 1950s sci-fi gone wrong.